Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Good morning, I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Here are the stories we're following today.
Karen, we begin with a health scare at McDonald's and a plunge in shares of the fast food giant. For the latest, let's bring in Bloomberg's John Tucker. John.
And Nathan, the CDC says 49 people from 10 states have contracted E. coli traced to ingredients in McDonald's Quarter Pounders. 10 people have been hospitalized. An elderly person in Colorado has died. Every patient interviewed by the CDC said they ate at McDonald's before falling ill. Most said they ate Quarter Pounder hamburgers specifically. McDonald's USA president is Joe Erlinger.
This is a temporary change as the investigation continues, and we are working quickly to return our full menu in these states as soon as possible.
Well, the company thinks it could be the onions that go into Quarter Pounders. Apparently, the Quarter Pounders are the only sandwiches that routinely take these particular onions. The true number of people infected likely much higher than is currently known and may involve additional states, according to the CDC. McDonald's is a member of the Dow. It also has the 35th biggest weighting in the S&P 500. A major outbreaks can haunt restaurant chains for years. You'll recall back in 2015, an E. coli and norovirus outbreak across Chipotle locations in multiple states led to a drastic drop in sales there. McDonald's shares down 6% pre-market. In New York, I'm John Tucker, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, John, thank you. Now we want to turn to geopolitics and the latest from the Middle East. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is on his way to Saudi Arabia after meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem. He says they both agreed that the killing of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar has opened new possibilities for ending the war in Gaza.
We are resolute in our defense of Israel when it comes to attacks it's receiving from Iran, from Iran's proxies. And we stand with Israel and will always stand with Israel in its defense. It's also very important that Israel respond in ways that do not create greater escalation and do not risk spreading the conflict.
Antony Blinken is on his 11th trip to the Middle East since the October 7th Hamas attack that sparked the Gaza conflict. Overnight, Israel said it confirmed the death of cleric Hashem Safadine in an airstrike in Lebanon 3 weeks ago. He was widely expected to become the next leader of Hezbollah after the killing of Hassan Nasrallah.
Now, Karen, let's head back to the U.S. and get the latest from the campaign trail. Kamala Harris says she would work with Congress to raise the federal minimum wage to at least $15 an hour if elected. The vice president discussed her economic proposals in an interview with NBC News.
My plans are focused on working people, the middle class, and what we must do to strengthen hardworking people to be able to do what they dream and aspire to be able to do. His plans are about giving tax cuts, massive tax cuts, to billionaires and big corporations.
Vice President Harris has called for raising the minimum wage before, but hasn't specified a dollar amount. Former President Trump sidestepped a question about the issue during a campaign stop at a McDonald's in Pennsylvania over the weekend.
Well, Nathan, Donald Trump was back in North Carolina last night touting his pledge to make it easier to buy a car.
I will make interest on car loans fully tax deductible because affording a car is essential to restoring the American.
At a rally in Greensboro, North Carolina, the former president said the tax break would only apply to cars made in the U.S. He did not say whether his plan would apply to foreign-owned automakers that manufacture in the U.S., like Volkswagen, Toyota, and Hyundai.
Well, Karen, Donald Trump's views on monetary policymakers and global trade are being challenged by Christine Lagarde. In an interview with Bloomberg, the European Central Bank president invited the Republican nominee to ECB's headquarters in Frankfurt.
He should come and visit us. And, you know, I have thousands of hardworking people, economists, jurists, computer scientists, and I can assure you that they work super hard every day, not just once a month.
ECB President Christine Lagarde made the comments to Bloomberg's Francine Lacroix. Donald Trump told Bloomberg earlier this month the Fed chair has the greatest job in government. In his words, you show up to the office once a month.
Well, turning to the markets now, Nathan, bonds are extending declines this morning. They've sold off significantly since the Fed started cutting interest rates. Two-year Treasury yields have climbed 34 basis points in September. That's a move not seen since 1995. Bank of America CEO Bryan Moynihan has urged Federal Reserve policymakers to be measured.
We've got to get back in line. And so they're on that path. They were late to the game. They got to make sure they don't go too hard now. And that's what they are all trying to figure out watching the data.
Bryan Moynihan tells Bloomberg he expects the Fed to cut rates by 50 basis points by the end of the year.
Well, that differs, Karen, from the view of Apollo Management chief economist Torsten Slok. He says the chances are rising the Fed doesn't cut at all next month.
I mean, you really do begin to ask the question, where is the slowdown? And as we have been debating before, is monetary policy really restrictive? If it is so restrictive, why is the economy still doing so well?
Apollo Management chief economist Torsten Slok says tailwinds from looser financial conditions, higher government spending, and elevated stocks and GDP growth are building.
Well, Nathan, it's a busy day on the earnings front with nearly 3 dozen companies in the S&P 500 reporting. We'll hear from Coca-Cola, IBM, and AT&T today. We also have a couple of big reports out of Europe this morning. We go to London and get the latest from Bloomberg's Ewan Potts. Good morning, Ewan.
Karen and Nathan, Deutsche Bank has reported a 42% increase in profits in the third quarter, helped by gains at the investment bank. But Germany's biggest lender also sounding a note of caution, setting aside more money to cover bad debt. Over at Heineken, it was bad weather in Europe and slow consumer spending in the US that saw beer volumes miss estimates. But the Dutch brewer says higher pricing means it will still hit its profit target for the year. And over at the world's biggest beauty company, another sales decline in China. The 5th straight quarter of lower sales there for L'Oreal. Investors today asking if the shares are still worth it. In London, I'm Ewan Potts, Bloomberg Radio.
Thanks, Ewan. Apple CEO Tim Cook is in China, promising to keep investing in the country during a meeting with Beijing's top technology official. China is the world's largest smartphone market and remains Apple's most important market outside the U.S. This is Tim Cook's second visit to the country this year.
And finally, Nathan, what would you like to hear about on Bloomberg Radio? Help make shows like ours even better by taking our Bloomberg audience survey. Visit youtube.com/Bloomberg podcast and click the link in our profile or community section to take the survey, which is hosted by our partners Material. Fill it out now at youtube.com/Bloomberg podcasts. Time now for a look at some of the other stories making news in New York and around the world. And for that, we're joined by Bloomberg's Michael Barr. Michael, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. The Georgia Supreme Court rejected a last-minute push by the Republican Party to reinstate a set of new election rules that included, among other things, a requirement that ballots be hand-counted in the upcoming U.S. presidential vote. The Republican National Committee challenged a lower court's decision last week to strike down the rules as unlawful. Scott Turner, founder of the nonprofit Eternal Vigilance Action.
That collective sigh of relief you heard was from our election officials around the state.
The court's decision means the rules will remain blocked at least heading into the November 5th election. 2 Georgia election workers defamed by former Trump attorney Rudy Giuliani are getting some of his prized possessions. The ruling comes from a federal judge as Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss have been trying to collect on a $146 million defamation judgment. The possessions include his 1980 Mercedes-Benz, signed photos of Yankees legends, some luxury watches, and his New York City apartment. We're learning more about the arrest of the former CEO of Abercrombie & Fitch. Michael Jeffries, along with 2 other co-defendants, have been indicted for allegedly running an international prostitution and sex trafficking ring for decades. According to the Eastern District of New York, they forced male models into participating in lewd acts. U.S. Attorney Bryan Peace.
To anyone who thinks they can exploit and coerce others by using the so-called casting couch system, this case should serve as a warning.
Jeffrey's attorney says that they will respond in court, not in the media. Los Angeles County District Attorney George Gasson says that he'll have an announcement soon on his decision regarding a possible resentencing of the Menendez brothers.
As I said about 10 days ago, I said I would make a decision within 10 days or so. I plan to have a decision by the end of this week.
Lyle and Eric Menendez were sentenced to life in prison for the 1989 murders of their parents. Their defense team says there is new evidence supporting the brothers' claims of sexual and physical abuse by their parents. New York's MTA may face a $652 million budget shortfall in 2028 as higher overtime costs and lower fare box collections threaten to strain the transit agency's finances. New York State Comptroller Thomas DiNapoli warned in a report that about $200 million larger than the MTA's own projections for its budget gap in 2028. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr. This is Bloomberg, Karen.
All right, Michael Barr, thank you. Time now for the Bloomberg Sports Update, brought to you by Tri-State Audi. Here's John Stashower. John, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. The Knicks made a couple of big offseason moves in hopes of catching the Celtics to the Eastern Conference. They added Karl-Anthony Towns and Mikal Bridges for one night anyway. Those moves didn't help. Opening night in Boston, so the Celtics hoisted the championship banner and then took a 24-point lead in the first half. Boston won 132-109. Jason Tatum scored 37. He made 8 of the Celtics' 29 three-pointers. 29 threes, ties the NBA record. Then some NBA history in L.A. LeBron James sharing the court with his son Bronny. He only played 3 minutes. The Lakers beat Minnesota. Good start for the Rangers. Good start to their season. They're 5-0-1 in Montreal. 2 goals in the first 2 minutes. Rangers won 7-2. Devils lost to Tampa Bay 8-5. The Islanders lost to Detroit 1-0. Capitals won 4-1 at Philadelphia. The Bruins shut out in Nashville 4-0. No lack of star power for the World Series that begins Friday in L.A., but there's no doubt who the biggest headliners are, and here's Aaron Judge on Shohei Ohtani.
Hits for average, hits for power, the speed, doing what he did this year with the 50 stolen bases. That's it got talked about a lot, but I don't think it got talked about enough. It's just he's an impressive athlete, the best player in the game, and what an ambassador for this sport.
Speaking of Ohtani, the ball he hit for his 50th home run was sold at auction for $4.4 million. Meanwhile, a Dodger legend has passed away. Fernando Valenzuela was 63, had been ill, came from Mexico, burst onto the scene as a 20-year-old in 1981. Fernando Mania was born. He won the Rookie of the Year and the Cy Young. John Stashower, Bloomberg Sports. Karen, Nathan.
Coast to coast on Bloomberg Radio, nationwide on Sirius XM, and around the world on Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app. This is Bloomberg Daybreak.
Good morning. I'm Nathan Hager, bringing you an exclusive conversation with Bank of America CEO Bryan Moynihan, speaking with Bloomberg's Heidi Stroud-Watts in Sydney. They talked about interest rates, his warning for the Fed, and what the election could mean for America's fiscal situation. Let's listen in.
You think about the U.S. economy, you have great insight into what's going on. If you look at that consumer spending this year, the month of October so far versus last year, or third quarter versus last year's third quarter, it's up in the 4 to 5% range, which is consistent with a low inflation, low growth economy. That's across about $1.25 trillion to $1.5 trillion spent in a quarter. So it's a big sample, and the people moving around, they spend it each quarter on all different things, but it's generally growing consistent where we were pre-pandemic when you had, Fed funds rate at the 2% level, 2.5% level. You had inflation in control, and you had growth in the 2% level. So that gives us confidence that our experts that do all analysis are backed up by the data we see in our clients, and that's what we see.
For the consumer, is there a degree of bifurcation there demographically?
It's less about bifurcation because I'd assume that there's sort of two. Look, inflation hits people in the lower income brackets more than it does others but the good news is gas prices have come down. Food prices have tipped over. Inflation's in control. It's down in the 3% range as opposed to it was running pretty hot. And so that helps. But if you have auto debt, that debt, and you want to get a new car, that debt is higher. If you have mortgage debt and you already had a mortgage loan, it's very low. And so it really depends on the consumer and really where they are. But the average American consumer has more money than they did before the pandemic, is in better credit quality before the pandemic, still has the money in accounts from some of this stimulus in the pandemic, and is spending money. And that's all good stuff for the U.S. economy because we're such a consumer. That's the unique thing about it. It's a consumer-driven economy. It's a consumer-led economy.
Are you thinking about making allocations or allowances for stress at this point?
We always do that. So every quarter we run stress tests, thousands of them. Every day we run them in the markets, business stuff. We always look at it. And so what's the case if it turns out the wrong way? So even how we set our reserves, we have a modeled series of cases we put in. So it's not all base case. Base case is about half, and the rest are stress cases, and you add them all together. We're actually set set our reserves as if unemployment was going to be at 5% at the end of next year, not what the market predicts at 4.3. So there's a conservatism built into that, and then we look beyond that.
There's also some potential complications for the Fed depending on what happens in just under 2 weeks' time, right? Does the fiscal scenario, particularly under another Trump administration, but also certainly there are risks when it comes to the Harris camp as well. Is that something that you're thinking about?
I would separate a very near-term question of the Fed getting the trajectory. Our experts have them cutting again a couple more times this year, so 100 basis points this year and another 100 basis points more evenly spread each quarter next year, and gets to 3 to 3.25 as a terminal rate. And then inflation comes down to the 2.3% as we move into 25 and 26. And so that is a well-engineered Fed change. And so the danger is that data, or they go too fast or too slow, and that risk is higher now than it was 6 months ago. And so as they move, everybody's going to watch them, and you see the sell-off in treasuries one day and you see the rally the other day. Everybody's going to watch all that. That is completely different from, and I don't think that'll be impacted by the elections at all. The fiscal problem in the United States, and to give you the soundbite, the U.S. just finished a fiscal year. The budget deficit for that year was equal to the entire economy of the country of Australia, $1.8 trillion. So think about the size of that, and we've got to get it back in line. These are good times, and we should be managing it more carefully. And frankly, we need to have the politicians who set those budgets, fund those budgets, and run tax policy against those budgets to figure out how to make this work. It's probably going to be raising revenue and cutting expense, or some combination. It's not a new problem, but it's one we got to start to wrestle with. Not that it's critical tomorrow morning, but it'll be critical over the next few years.
But given that risk, do you think the Fed went too big too soon?
No, they were late to the game, and they admit that, so it's nothing that we're saying. It's they were late, and they had to move fast because inflation got ahead of them, and they've done a good job of bringing it back down from probably a double-digit rate down to about 3% last quarter, 3.25%. So they're getting close to it, and it's never, the inflation average from one of my teammates told me from 1990 to 2024 was 2.5%. The inflation average from 2000 to 2020 was 2.5%. It's 4.5% just in the last 2020 to 24, and so we've got to get back in line. And so they're on that path. They were late to the game. They got to make sure they don't go too hard now, and that's what they are all trying to figure out watching the data. But whether it's a terminal rate that's the key, and that we think is around 3%. That's a whole different interest rate environment in the U.S. and other markets than it's been in the last 15 years or so.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak, your morning podcast on the stories making news from Wall Street to Washington and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed by 6 a.m. Eastern each morning on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen.
You can also listen live each morning starting at 5 a.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 92.9 in Boston, and nationwide on Sirius XM Channel 121.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, now with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto interfaces.
And don't forget to subscribe to Bloomberg News Now. It's the latest news whenever you want it, in 5 minutes or less. Search Bloomberg News Now on your favorite podcast platform to stay informed all day long. I'm Karen Moscow.
And I'm Nathan Hager. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak.